welcome to you from, if you're very sharp and looking out the windows, you'll see different parts of the world this time, because Jerry's joining us from Wisconsin, and I've written down that you're the pastor of Lake Street United Methodist Church in Eau Claire, Wisconsin. Welcome aboard, and good to have you with you, but it's evening where you are. And Trish and Katie, you've been a part of this before. Lovely to have the three of you here. And we're talking about Mark 8:27 and following, and a little bit more of a messianic secret scene, but let's leave Katie to give us a bit of background on this passage.
Well, thank you, Michael. And I think that there's actually a lot of really interesting stuff going on in this passage. Jesus asks the disciples who he is. They say, some say John the Baptist, others say Elijah. And then this is, the really shining moment for Peter when he says, "You are the Christ." Of course, he then goes on to kind of have an equally significant downfall just a few verses later. But one of the things that I wanted to reflect on is that I think that this passage gives us a lot to think about in the nature of revelation. Okay, so in the preceding passage, we have reference to the miraculous feeding of the 5,000 and Jesus breaking the loaves and there being lots of bread available. And then Jesus and the disciples get into the boat. And they didn't bring any bread with them. And Jesus says, "Beware the leaven of the Pharisees," right? And what I want to draw attention to is that he's speaking metaphorically, but they're speaking literally. And one of the problems that we have in this passage is this kind of pivot between what is symbolic or metaphorical or theological and what's literal. And Jesus trying to communicate something to the disciples, but running into their inability to kind of understand what he's saying really at any level. So in that previous example, he was speaking metaphorically. He was saying you have to watch out for the Pharisees, and these leaders. And they think he's talking about the bread, and they're just very confused. But what happens then in this passage is that he basically tries to speak without parables. He tries to say exactly what's going to happen, which is kind of unusual in the Bible. Even among the prophets, very rarely do you get very explicit foretelling of events. But Jesus says, in 3 days, I'll be crucified and risen and all this stuff. And they don't understand. And this is something that actually comes up multiple times in the Gospel of Mark. The disciples, I think, understand when he's speaking in parables, but they also don't understand here when he's trying to speak to them very, very directly. And so I think there's a message for us here about how revelation works and about our position in being willing and open to receive what God is trying to tell us. And even sometimes like Peter, when you get the right answer, not knowing what the right answer means, which he clearly doesn't seem to understand. So I think that those were some of my initial reflections that I thought would help get us started.
Okay, thanks. Well, I've got a couple of things that draw out of this, and I'm going to throw them your way, Trish, but you can ignore them if you like. That's fine. We do have, for whatever reason, these disciples are pretty obtuse, and sometimes I think we are as well. That's a challenge for me. And the other challenge that Katie's risen is this question of how do we know what level to read and to hear this part of the Jesus story? Trish.
Well, I think that it's really interesting, Peter's response, because he says, "You are the Messiah," got this great vision about who Jesus is. So he gets the title right, but he doesn't have the meaning or the understanding right. He thinks, Jesus is going to come in and burn and slash, so to speak. But in fact, so he says, yes, you're the Messiah in the light of all the miracles that have taken place. So he has an understanding. But then Jesus goes on to be explicit, as you say, quite plain, quite honest, quite painfully honest. And I'm thinking, would Peter have been so enthusiastic at the end of, would he have made that same response? So I'm not quite answering your question, Mike, but I'm thinking that's a real challenge for me. What is it we're saying yes to?
That's good. That's helping tease it out a bit. Jerry, you're going to be unpacking this or something like it at some stage. And where is that challenging? I mean, these levels that this is operating at and how we implement what we find about Jesus.
I love the way Trish just put it, that they got the title right, but didn't get the rest. Mm. One of the things I love about the Gospel of Mark as a teacher myself is that we get to see Jesus, the teacher, trying to guide his disciples not to understand the message that he's giving them, but to point them in the direction for them to find it out themselves.
Nice.
And here in chapter 8, we have this turning point. At last, they figured it out, or at least Peter has. You're the Messiah, which is great for 10 seconds, 3 maybe. And then Jesus says, wonderful, excellent. Now let's move on to the second part of the class. Let me tell you what the Messiah is, what the Messiah is here for. And they're not ready for that. And in fact, 2 more times in Mark, he will try to tell them, and each time that will be followed by the disciples doing something completely obtuse. But it's Jesus teaching people one step along the way. And yeah, the question for us is, great, I'm so glad that we've learned what we can. What are we missing? And where's the next step? Because we're always being led to the next step by Christ.
Lovely, thank you. And then, where is the good news? Where are we heading with this, Katie?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's that, it's that famous line, from Shakespeare, that the world is bigger than your philosophy, Horatio, or whatever, At this point in Second Temple Judaism, the expectation is that the Messiah is going to lead an armed rebellion, like just the Maccabees, right? And they're going to cast out the Romans, and then they're going to reestablish Zion and Jerusalem in this independent Jewish state. And so when people are talking about a Messiah, that's what people are expecting. And that's actually what happens in the 2nd century with Bar Kokhba, right? But what Jesus means by Messiah is not that at all. And I think that it's this completely unthinkable concept about what a Messiah is supposed to be, that what he's actually supposed to be is suffer and die. And not just the Messiah, but that everybody that follows him is supposed to take up your cross and come after me. And so I think that it's actually good news because it is the coming about of the kingdom of God, but it's not good news in a really cheap and easy way that everything's going to be really easy.
So certainly no kind of Taliban, dare I say it, overthrow here. Good news, Jerry, where? Jesus is shifting our understanding of what this good news is. Where are we when we hear it now?
I deal with this all the time. I'm serving as the pastor of a church in the U.S. We all know we are supposed to make disciples in Jesus' name. We're supposed to go ye therefore and make disciples of all nations. But the easy and comfortable interpretation of that is, we're supposed to glom onto more members. We're supposed to gain numbers. And that's where everything is set up. And that's kind of what Peter's doing here. He says, yay, we've got the Messiah. Now we can start the rebellion. And Jesus says, no, that's not what I've come for. And we in the church have to ask the same question. Yes, the kingdom has come. But you know what? That might not mean comfort for us. That might not mean a new Christian kingdom on earth. That might not mean success. That might not mean comfort. That might not mean being able to pay the bills. Peter can't stand that. He goes up to Jesus and says, now, Jesus, you're being very negative right now. I can feel the negativity myself. Why don't we talk about some positive things about being a Messiah? Can you repeat after me? I am the Messiah, and doggone it, I'm good enough. Will you just say that for me? And Jesus says, will you shut up?
Yeah, it's very much that moment, isn't it? And Mark is so big on this. Peter hasn't got it. We haven't got it. The disciples haven't got it. Trish, tell me some good news.
Well, I think there are 2 pieces of good news in this. And the first is that we don't have to do this on our own. Jesus isn't calling us anywhere to go that he hasn't already gone before. And I just find that hugely encouraging. I don't have to do it on my own. And B, Jesus is exercising significant leadership here. It's invitation rather, well, I suppose it's command as well, but it's primarily invitation, not to the glossy, easy, cheap, as you say, Katie, way ahead, but And then the other thing is that even though he must be exasperated with the disciples, he stays in good relationship with them. So he journeys with them at their pace. And I think the good news is we might not get it initially, but if we're willing to commit to a life of discipleship, we do eventually deepen our understanding and stay connected to this question all the time, who do you say I am?
Okay, so Jerry, I'm going to come back to you with what we're calling here the so what, and you're in a slightly cultural different space to us. There's some big questions around the so what when you kind of picked a dominant paradigm, the kind of successful paradigm, and I'm hearing something else emerging out of what we're saying about this passage. So what?
The so what, for me, as I look at, I'm a part of a church that in the next few years will probably collapse the denomination for various reasons. The so what is that isn't what we were called for anyway.
No.
The church is not in any danger because God's in charge of the church. And Jesus calls us not to go out and conquer the world. Jesus calls us to take up a cross. And if we're willing to do that, we will be, well, all shall be well and all manner of things will be well.
Thank you. Yeah.
Whether it's comfortable or not, I'm not sure.
Yeah.
But it will be well. It
will be well. Trish, does that resonate for you as something in your experience, applying, if you like, in the world around you?
And I think this whole journey is one of relinquishing our control and our thinking that we can do all this, the slash and burn mentality, and that actually we are following leadership, discipleship that is the complete antithesis of the slash and burn. And I think we need to be constantly asking this question about who do you say that I am? Because if we don't know who Jesus is, who the Christ is, and the meaning in our lives, we need to know that. I'll frame it more positively. We need to know because it's that relationship that's formative and grows and develops us. And yeah, that's.
So, Katie, I feel I've kind of left you on the wings there, but it's all very well, teaching this stuff, but there's people hurting. And as Jerry indicated, the Methodist isn't the only church in the US. We as Anglicans in New Zealand are experiencing this implosion, I guess. So what? Where is this so what answer for us?
Yeah, I think that if we look at how the revelation unfolds in Mark, I think in some ways Jesus does his best to make them understand, but there's a certain sense in which I think he knows that they're not going to understand because what he's proposing is so radically different from anything in their entire worldview that would lead them to expect this, that it is actually impossible for them to understand it before it happens. But he's laying the groundwork so that later after it happens, they can be like, oh, that's what he was talking about. It all makes sense now. So I think it's okay in a sense that they don't get it now because in a way, I think it's impossible for them to have gotten it before it happens. And so I think that the positive message here is that there's this journey and that when the time comes, all of the things that needed to happen are in place to see how God is working out this plan that would have been completely unforeseeable before it finally comes into being. And so I think that for the disciples, what we see with the message of the cross and the resurrection is that it turns out to be much better than what they could have anticipated and expected. And I think the same thing is true for us today that, we kind of, I think, set our sights too low and that God has all these blessings in the working out of his kingdom to give us. And they're too good that we haven't even imagined them. And I think that it's that kind of mystery, that there might be clues along the way, but we can be hopeful that whatever comes will be better than what we were actually expecting.
So there you are. You song to my heart because, of course, I couldn't get by without mentioning Paul and eye has not seen nor ear heard. So thank you. I think we're finding good news, finding a so what, finding a real message for us in rather strange times for us all. So Jerry from Wisconsin, Trish from over the hill in Mosgiel, and Katie from the wilds of Dunedin, thank you for being a part of this and breaking open the word.